Hello, Dr. Hahn. Just real quickly, I read a good number of your works from your first work, Rome Sweet Home, and all the way through the Lamb's Supper and God Who Keeps His Promises. At least one or two others. In my mind, the most extraordinary was the Lamb's Supper. But anyhow, I have a question. This is more historical. I read the New Testament probably, a few times. My knowledge is very sketchy. How did Paul evangelize in the Greco-Roman world, a world that knew nothing of messiahs? And there might have been just one part of that ancient world, maybe the Persian world, that might have known something of a messiah, if you remember the three kings. What was his strategy? Just as sometimes we speak of a Socratic method to truth, was there a Pauline method to giving Christ to a world? We know he didn't do too good in Athens, and so Athens was a world expecting a philosopher king. The Roman world was probably expecting a Caesar. How did he do it?
Yeah, Russ, I think Dr. Hahn has the gist.
Let me jump in at this point, because I know you didn't intend to insult my favorite New Testament writer, and you didn't. But everybody just assumes that in Acts 17, Paul failed when he evangelized the Athenians on Mars Hill. If you look carefully at the end of that chapter, you discover that Dionysius was converted, who in the tradition becomes the first bishop and a great saint, and arguably more. But if we're just simply concerned about, quantity as opposed to quality, then we might describe this as a failure. But I think it's a great first attempt. And what we have to recognize in Acts 17:16, as he is approaching Athens and begins to preach, you're right, he doesn't have the Old Testament law and prophets to draw from. He doesn't have the Messiah as an expectation. But what he does reveals how much cultural homework he did, so that in his proclamation there's a great deal of cultural engagement. Because you'll note that in Acts 17, he does something like he does in the book that he wrote to Titus. He quotes Epimenides. Epimenides was, I think, around the 5th century, and he was the most revered of the sages, the poets, and the prophets of the time. And the story goes, and this is backed up in a book by Don Richardson entitled Eternity in Their Hearts, in a chapter called The Melchizedek Factor. He seemed to be aware of the fact that Athens was faced with extinction about 4 centuries earlier due to a pestilence. And the Athenian elders had exhausted all of the material and spiritual means to avert this thing or to get it lifted. And so they consulted Epimenides, who came from Crete. And when he arrived, he basically gave them this advice. You're going to have to admit that you have offended the heavens, but that you're also ignorant of the God that you have offended. And so we have the quotation from Epimenides, in him we live and move and have our being. But when Paul is pointing to these altars to the unknown God, agnostou theou, what most people don't recognize is that those altars go back about 4 centuries, because Epimenides' advice to the Athenian elders was, bring the sheep of your flocks to this hill in the morning, and any sheep that lay down from the grazing, build altars there and offer those sheep as sacrifice. The shepherds laughed because they said in the morning, sheep don't lay down on the ground, but the next morning they did. And they erected altars wherever they did, and they offered the sheep. And the plague was averted. And so when Paul is talking about the altars to the unknown God on the one hand, and then quoting Epimenides on the other, we have failed to connect the dots. We have failed to see how culturally engaged Paul was, how much cultural homework he did. Now, the philosophical spectrum in Athens was so wide. You had skeptics, you had relativists, you had Stoics, but you had people in every camp who were prepared by the Holy Spirit to hear the gospel of Jesus' death and resurrection. Does that mean it's all got to be done in a day, that they're going to be saved by the evening? No, but men like Dionysius were evangelized, presumably catechized, and not just baptized, but ordained to the priesthood and the episcopate. So I would say study Paul to see how he evangelized the pagan world that wasn't expecting a Messiah, and get ready to engage your own culture by really doing your homework and mine, so that we can speak to people who really have no familiarity or background with Christianity.
Russ in San Antonio, thanks for the call.